Africa, we, mama. Free, free, mama. Dévaluation du Tangana. Organisation Unité Africaine.
Well, that's just my favorite Senegalese artist, Sheikh Lo, to introduce this brief addendum on the African states and the degree to which there's a uniquely African crisis. As I probably already made clear, or just the data itself made clear yesterday, it clearly seems like there's something going on in Africa that merits our attention. The way when the global map of the Fragile States Index was on the screen, you could see that the African continent just jumps off the page with its bright orange and dark red warning colors. So I think it is fair to say that there is something of a uniquely African crisis, and if you read my chapter, you probably have a sense of why I think that is the case, what seems to explain that. And I hinted at that a little bit. I'm going to say a little more in depth about my chapter today, or in this addendum, to kind of give you a sense of why I think there is, in fact, this uniquely African state problem. So to what degree, or what are the kind of terms of this problem? Well, using the Fragile States Index again, 7 of the top 10 most fragile states are located in Africa. And it's been that way basically since the Fragile States, then called Failed States Index, came out first in 2005. There's always been a heavily predominant majority of African states at the top of the failed, or at the failed end of the spectrum, or fragile to failed end of the spectrum. The other top 3, just to give you an idea of kind of what we're talking about, the other 3 in the top 10 are Syria, Yemen, and Afghanistan. So 3 cases of massive, extended, deeply destabilizing conflicts that have created massive humanitarian crises. So that's the neighborhood we're talking about, and so counting for 7 of the top 10 of those is quite a significant data point. As you go further down the list, 17 of the top 25 most fragile states are in fact African. And again, it's just been this way since the index was first released in 2005. At the other end of the spectrum, Africa accounts for none of the least or most sustainable states, nor even any of the top 25. It's a troubling situation. So yeah, I think it is fair to make the argument that the level of fragility in Africa is just considerably more severe than in the rest of the world. We can see it through these data. What I did here is download the 2019 Fragile States Index data, put it in a spreadsheet, and created, in case you're wanting to geek out a little bit, coded all the countries, African, non-African. That's called creating a dummy variable. Every state that's Africa got a value of 1, then all other countries got a value of 0. You can use this to kind of do what's called comparison of means, or analysis of variance, and just kind of get a quick glimpse of 2 groups in terms of their what's called measures of central tendency. Like what does the data really in a nutshell look like? And you can see from the first chart here that these are the non-African states. First thing I'd note is, non-African states run the gamut from the worst to the very best. But I'd call your attention to the measures of central tendency that I have posted here. The median measure, the median value for non-African states is 113. That means it's the rank is 113. A median score is the middle, right? So it's the middle case. So the middle of that population ranks 113. The mean for these kind of data, this ordinal data, is a little kind of somewhat meaningless in some sense. It's curious to calculate the mean, but I just did it just to give you a sense of what we're kind of looking at. The average, the mean, of the non-African states is a rank of 107. Okay? Now, what that means, just to kind of put this, give some context for that, the median, the middle case of non-African states, at 113 is 65 spots from the top rank of 178. Now, there are more states in the system than 178, but there are a number of ties. So the top rank, Finland, I think it is, or Iceland rather, is ranked 178. So the middle of the non-African population of states is 65 ranks below that. And the mean is even further. It's 71 spots from the top rank. Whereas if we look at the African state, the population of African states, again we have running not quite to the top, but from the most failed to pretty high on the list. Ghana gets a pretty good score. And I think Mauritius and Seychelles do pretty well. But the median score there is a real teller, right? The median, that middle case, is 36. That's 142 spots from the top rank. The mean is 131 spots. So again, I think that's just a clear indication that the level of fragility is just considerably quantitatively more severe in the African context. Now, an analysis of trend data, I don't have the time series data, but I can discuss it, and I mentioned it also in my chapter. So not only is the situation as I've just described it problematic, but matters appear to be getting worse in Africa at a more significant rate than anywhere else. Now, I'll break this down a little bit. African countries, or African states, suffered a mean increase in their failed states index score, which means they're moving in the direction of failure, nearly 3 times that of non-African states, right? So a mean increase over time means they move faster towards failure than non-African states, including all countries moving toward failure. So just excluding those countries that are not moving in the wrong direction, but taking the population of African and non-African states that are moving towards failure, even amongst that collection of states moving in the direction of failure, African states still, stand out as moving 1.5 times faster towards failure than non-African states. And then, if you kind of reverse the trend and you take all the states in the index that were moving over the years in the direction of sustainability or improvement, recovery, unfortunately, African states improved their scores, recovered at a far slower pace than non-African states. So another way of saying this is that when African states get on the track toward failure, they move down that track considerably faster. When they get on a recovery track, they seem to recover more slowly than non-African states. So again, there's just something quite specific and concerning about this, right? Oh, it's just the same duplicate. About my chapter, the title is perhaps a bit provocative. Africa, is there a state? But I model that. I think I cited him or mentioned his title in my chapter on a work by Crawford Young, who's a retired professor emeritus at Wisconsin, the leading scholar on the colonial state in Africa, who and also quite an expert on the contemporary state, who published an article back in the 70s, I believe, late 70s, asking that question. Zaire, which is now Democratic Republic of Congo. Zaire, is there a state? And what he was getting at was not, posing the possibility that there just weren't any institutions of statehood present or recognizable, but rather, in fact, quite the opposite for some. I mean, the presidency, he noted, was particularly robust. But of course, that's where the security apparatus was located, and that's where Sezizoko Mobutu, the longtime dictator of Zaire, resided. So, we had some institutions of statehood that functioned rather robustly, but the rest, the public health, the infrastructure, all that stuff, the educational institutions of state, all of that had essentially rotted away. Decayed is his term, from abuse. Right. Well, in fact, here's his explanation for why the state seems to have just functionally disappeared in the Zaire Congo case. He saw three vectors of that state decay, what he calls shrinkage in the competence, the credibility, and the probity of the state. So by competence, I think that's quite directly connected to what we discussed yesterday, the state capacity, the ability of the state to formulate policy, implement effectively the policies, and achieve the outcomes that it seeks. Right. So just a complete lack of competence. Credibility related, in our discussion yesterday of legitimacy, the credibility of the state as a result among the Zairean population obviously fell through the floor, right? When the state appears to be completely incompetent, the population gets none of what it expects from a state, then the credibility of the state collapses. And so we use the term legitimacy now, but that's what he's talking about. And then the probity of the state, right? The kind of degree to which the state acts in a proper fashion, right? That kind of relates to one of the things I'll say about our understanding of modern states coming from social theory. We have a sense that the state is a moral agent, but clearly, Zaire was in no capacity acting with probity. It was just a venal, corrupt system. And so incompetence, lack of legitimacy, and corruption of a most severe kind were the three vectors carrying this pathology of decay, as he puts it. And I take that as a pretty useful way of thinking about what we've just identified as this kind of uniquely African state crisis. And it led me to ask the same question that Crawford Young asked for Zaire. Is there a state, as we understand that concept, in Africa wide? Right? Now, let me just kind of make a point here. Right? One generalizes about the entire continent of Africa at one's peril. It's a very complex, very variegated, very diverse environment. 54 countries, 2,000 languages. It's almost impossible to make meaningful generalizations of any depth without running afoul of I think stereotyping and painting with too broad a brush. So I took this project on with some hesitation. So I want to make it clear what I'm not saying when I talk about the possibility of it being reasonable to say that the state, as we understand that concept, really doesn't exist in the African context. What this does not mean. It does not mean that Africa is a hopeless continent, as you can see The Economist thought so in 2001. That's the cover and the cover story titled "The Hopeless Continent." Just a wildly irresponsible bit of journalism there to write off an entire continent as diverse as I just described as hopeless. It's just an absolute abrogation of journalistic responsibilities and ethics. Africa is not a continental train wreck, as I make clear, I hope I make clear in my chapter, there is much going on in Africa of great imports, and uh, you know, many signs of very exciting things still to come. It's just that little of those things are directly or meaningfully connected to the state in any obvious way. It's not always the case, but quite often that's the case. Africa is not a continent of conflict, and I think that was quite clear yesterday in asking you to describe the data as represented in that conflict site data from Uppsala, and a number of you noted that, right, there just didn't appear to be a whole lot of that conflict in Africa, particularly when we compared it to, say, South Asia, with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and eastern parts of India, and then hopping over into Myanmar, and so it just Africa. But the reason I put this line in here is because people, even those who should know better, have had a tendency to view Africa as a continent of conflicts. And even in the worst of times, in the 1990s, when indeed, things were quite bad in many places, it was still then not a continent of conflict. And to not understand that is to fail to appreciate the most important question about conflict in Africa, or statehood in Africa, which is why some states succumb to even really horrific levels and intensity of violence, while neighboring African states that share the same risk factors said to be the cause for the conflicts in their neighbors do not succumb to conflict. Ghana and Senegal, sitting amidst these conflagrations of horrific conflict, came through unscathed, but yet they, in fact, do have all the risk factors like primary commodity export dependency, all these kinds of factors that are associated with conflict, and yet they don't. So the other reason I mentioned this is, as I said, even people who ought to know better sometimes make this assessment. I. William Zartman, truly one of the most prolific authors on Africa and African conflict, recently retired from Johns Hopkins, introduced one of his books, or opened one of his books with this line that Africa is sadly a continent of conflict, which, as I say, even at the height of the 90s, that wasn't true, right? And it's certainly not true now. In fact, as I've mentioned, there is a great deal going on in Africa that merits our attention, but as I say, it's just not clear that those things are related to statehood in any meaningful way. And in fact, The Economist has sort of picked up on this and changed its tune. So in 2011, it ran another cover story, not a hopeless continent, but Africa Rising, focusing on really optimistic forecasts based on several years of very impressive rates of economic growth across a great number of African countries. And then, kind of most recently, it's really changed its tune. It's now Africa Aspiring, right? It's now Africa seeing itself as joining the ranks of the BRICS, the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, the kind of emerging rise of the rest kind of countries, right? So it's a different tune in many, many respects, yet, as our data show, the problem of the state in Africa persists, and that's of great concern, because if we don't fix what's wrong, if it can be fixed, if first we don't grapple with it, we can't hope to perhaps sustain these exciting things that are happening, or we're going to put unnatural limits on the potential of these positive trends. Okay, so let's try to make a little sense of my book chapter. If you've read it, I kind of start with these 3 vignettes from Senegal. Senegal's chosen, as I state here, because it's deemed a relatively high performer state. I should look up, actually, where it is on the Fragile States Index, but it's middle of the pack, I'm sure, or better. But in terms of other elements of Senegalese politics, long been deemed one of the more successful democracies in Africa, one of the longer standing democracies, if you allow for some particular African post-colonial elements of politics that complicate the definition of democracy. But anyway, it's deemed a pretty successful state in many respects. So the point here is, methodologically speaking, for those of you interested in those things, the idea or the concept of a least likely case is what I'm doing here. A least likely case, methodologically or epistemologically, is using, if you're trying to kind of affirm a position or assess the merits of a hypothesis or something. One way of going about that is using what's called the least likely case study approach. That means you choose a case in which the phenomenon that you are trying to assert exists, or a problematic event or problematic quality that you're trying to affirm. If you choose a case where, given its characteristics, is least likely to demonstrate or present that condition, and you find it anyway, then you've got a basis for some confidence in your hypothesis. So Senegal kind of fits that least likely case with respect to issues of state fragility. So just the vignettes, kind of start when I'm out in this village of Kungani, very far out. It's as far as you can go from the Atlantic coast and the capital of Dakar, and still be in Senegal. It's east of the capital, all the way to the border with Mali and Mauritania. So I'm there in the village. Well, I'm doing an in situ archive. This is back in the early 2000s. I was building an archive in place in the village of Kungani, where Adrienne Adams, a well-known anthropologist, had spent 25 years of her life in that village, died in a car crash, and I was asked to go back because I had done some work there and met her a few times, and archive her life's work, digitize it, and all that kind of stuff. So, so that was part of that process, and I had ordered a few hundred archival quality boxes from Great Britain to be shipped to Senegal. And I had gone to customs before I left for Kungani, and they were there, but I couldn't get them out for some reason. There were some curious explanations. The paperwork wasn't quite ready, this and that. I kind of knew what was going on. They were waiting for me to just fork over some cash, but I thought I'd play it out a little bit. So I went on to Kungani, and that's when I discovered that my plan to call back to customs and discuss the terms of their release. I couldn't, because the cellular network, the Centel, just kept going down, just wouldn't function. So here we have a one of those things that we expect from states, kind of infrastructure, and then I notice, as I say, that the only way to call the capital of Senegal from within Senegal was to access the neighboring states' cellular network. And that's what I did. I just kind of used that, kind of roamed on the Mauritanian network, and then called back into the country, into the capital, to find out where my boxes were. And ultimately, the terms were that I basically had to pay 3 times what the boxes cost to get them out. And of course, that went straight into the hands of the customs agents. But that first one, that first vignette, is really about that first failure of the state to deliver what states are expected to deliver, the infrastructure. Right? In this case, kind of modern cyber infrastructure. The second one is more classical infrastructure. The newly constructed N1 highway, which connects Dakar with that area that I was in much more directly. So before N1, it would to get to Kungani in a day was about 17 hours drive in a jeep, and you had to go north and then just basically follow the river down. But this kind of cut straight through, so it was really exciting. Cut it down to about 13 hours, 12 hours maybe. But I discovered, the following year, the next year after that, the road just fell into, more deeper and deeper disrepair, far faster than it should have. And the story was that the contractor who got the government contract just, in classic fashion, just stole millions of it, pocketed it, and then, produced a shoddy product. I should say, if you look in this picture, I can't quite tell off in the distance, but that may be one of the other parts of the explanation. If that white vehicle is what I think it is, it's one of these massively overloaded long haul cargo trucks that come from the region. They come in from Mali and elsewhere to Dakar. Dakar is a major port center for the West Africa coast, and they're, invariably massively overweight. Right? By I can't imagine what magnitude, but at least probably 2 or 3 times what the maximum payload is supposed to be. At least it's amazing how they get it to all stay in and on top. So that weight on the roads is also part of the problem, but that's also on the state, right? The state can't seem to control that problem. That is a perfect function of the state. So here we have, right, on the one hand, the state can't seem to make the contractor make good on his obligations. They just couldn't seem to extract the money that they had given him back. It really speaks of limited state capacity in a very obvious, very real way. And then, the inability of the state to police its own roads and keep off those trucks that are doing such damage to the roads is another, kind of failure of governance or failure of the state. And as I say, for good measure, that day, going back to or going out, going back to the capital. My driver, has to stop at the internal customs post, and got fined for driving on an expired license. And as we drove away, I asked what he got fined for, because my Wolof wasn't all that great then, and he explained that he got fined for driving on an expired license, and I'm like, oh, well, that was too bad. Just couldn't get it done. He's like, oh, well, no, it's not expired. He just got bribed, or he was just, extorted. So, and he just wasn't the least bit bothered by it. He just saw it as part of the cost of, his business and doing his business. And that's, a pretty commonplace occurrence. So, yeah. And then lastly, as we follow N1 closer and closer back to the capital city, we reach the town towards the end of N1 of Chess. And Chess was the site of pretty significant political intrigue that year. The mayor of Chess, Idrissa Seck, was jailed. Well, actually, I should point out that he wasn't just mayor. He had by then already been prime minister of Senegal. He was jailed for his alleged offenses while mayor of Chess, which was to embezzle, including embezzlement of the funds for that N1 road, no less. The reality is, we're never going to know the whole story there, but we do know that Sek was sent to jail, was arrested and charged and put in jail, not because of, alleged embezzlement. The real permissive cause of his jailing sits to his right. That's Sek on the left and the former president Abdoulaye Wade on the right. They were best buddies. Sek was nationally known as Wade's second political son. Um, and they're very, very close. And then Sek made the mistake, as I say here, of kind of disagreeing with Wad on something, and then to such a degree that he actually threatened to challenge a run for the presidency against Wad when Wad was up for re-election. And shortly after that, Sek was arrested and put in jail. So, here's a kind of venality of the state. We're talking about put in the context of these three, we've got now venality, corruption, and just abuse of power at the very highest levels of the state. So what do we learn from these lessons, right? So I argue that each of these, right, these kind of quotidian, low stakes, modestly annoying kinds of state failures. The cellular network doesn't work. The highways are impassable. If I went back to that picture of the highway, you notice that there's these donkey carts on the sides of the road. The road got so impassable that you'd have to drive on the donkey cart for kilometers at a stretch. These kind of, as I say, from the lowest quotidian daily level of, we might say, the failures of the state in terms of infrastructure, cellular infrastructure, highways, all the way up to, including corrupt officials from, again, the lowest level, like a customs agent, all the way to the prime minister, captures the struggle of the state to perform the most basic functions associated with modern statehood. Right? As I say, some of these are low stakes, but it's really the accumulation of countless of these stories on a daily basis across the country. And you start to ask, why is that, right? And again, remember, this is Senegal. This is not Congo. This is not Sezizoko Mobutu Zaire or someplace. I mean, this is supposed to be Senegal, which is, pretty widely respected, right? So, is one possible answer that there simply is no state in Senegal as we have come to imagine the concept of modern statehood. And as I put it in my chapter, the state of the global political imaginary, this state that we kind of conceive of in our minds when we throw about the term state. Right? I think there's some reason to suspect that this might be so, is obviously what I identified. So Young, remember, identified three vectors of decay. Shrinkage in the competence, credibility, and probity of the state. Now, I think these vignettes talk about, right, or speak to or articulate really well with each of those three vectors of state decay, right? The competence from the, inability to maintain a cellular network, ability to extract the funds, rightfully the states, from the contractor who built them. The credibility of the state is at stake there when the roads that they pay to have built are impassable in short order and do not provide useful working infrastructure, and then the probity, the corruption that we see again from the kind of daily encounters that people have with state officials like customs agent, police officers, all the way again to the highest echelons of state power. So what I'm saying here is that though this is Senegal, and the level of incompetence, lack of legitimacy, and corruption doesn't rise to the level that we saw in Zaire in some of the worst cases. But the fact that this is a least likely case for it suggests that if you've got these vectors of state decay identifiable in Senegal, well, then we have reason to believe that they're probably evident in many other places. So, the question is, I'm not sure why that all jumped out there at one time, but why? Why is that, right? So the question I pose is there actually a state in Africa as we understand that concept? And as you know, I think there's reason to say that the answer is no. Okay, so the question is why. this problem, this uniquely African state problem. And my specific question in the book chapter is there actually something we can meaningfully refer to as a state, given the state as we conjure it in the contemporary political imaginary? So this raises the issue of what I call the origin story for the African state. Because if you think about it, the work we explored on state formation, Tilly and others, the war and state making as organized crime, all that material, those are all origin stories, and the early social theorists that I explore in my chapter, Comte, Hegel, Marx, Durkheim, Weber, are theorizing the state, but they're also in some fundamental sense telling a story about where the state comes from, its origin story. So what I try to do is draw on that body of social theory of the state that was produced right as the state itself was coming into its own. So these are not just important theorists and authors of classical works in the canon. They are, in some sense, eyewitness reports, if you will, of early modern state formation. So that's why I go to them rather than, say, basing the bulk of my analysis on, say, contemporary state theorizing like Tilly and such, because though Tilly is quite historically accurate, these theorists were kind of, as they say, they're at the birth, right? So these theorists, as I say here, tell rather particular stories about l'État, the state, right? They each kind of come at the issue of the emergent state from their own angle, their own particular set of interests. But there are kind of important ideas that I extract from that corpus of work that constitute collectively this imaginary, this image of the state that persists today in our thinking about what states are. So, first of all, there is this important concern among a number of them about the societal origins of the state, and this was particularly something of relevance to Marx and to Durkheim, and Marx and Durkheim differ on the degree to which the state they differ in their understanding of the relationship between the state and society, but they both recognize that the state finds its origins in the society. For Marx, it's the state emerges out of capitalist modes of production in society and comes to serve the interests of the ruling capitalist class. Durkheim has a slightly less revolutionary radical idea, but he too sees that forces within society, classes within society, or just actors within society come to have needs for something like the state because of modern society becoming what he referred to as ever more contractual, that we have ever more and more formal relationships with people. We need something like the state to, enforce contracts, as it were. So for both of them, it is critical to appreciate that the origin of the state lies in society. There's an organic state-society relationship there, right? That, is particular, perhaps uniquely true to the European context. Okay, the next point, to carry out its obligations, the state then gains autonomy from society. And we talked about, the concept of autonomy, and even in democratic states, even though the concept sounds a little authoritarian, is quite important. Just an example here, many have pointed to the emergence of central banks, particularly like, say, the Bank of England, uh, was deemed necessary to take from the king the business of, well, in today's terms, economic policy, but quite literally in the origins of the Bank of England, the King of England had a hard time borrowing money, even though he was the king. You'd think people would be keen to get into good favor with the King of England by lending him money. But if you think about it, as the sovereign, in a very classical sense, what obligation does King Henry have to pay back loans that he takes out? And if he's the sovereign, there's no higher authority than he. No one can really force him to pay back his loans, and that's well understood by lenders, right? So, in fact, lending to the crown was, kind of a poor business choice. In order to fix that problem, because obviously, as we talked about yesterday, revenue is of critical importance to any state. And if King Henry wanted to wage wars, or Queen Elizabeth wanted to wage wars against the Portuguese, they need to be able to borrow money. Because remember, in Britain, they don't have standing armies like they do in France and other places. So they need money to put to the service of raising armies and navies when necessary. And it was only through the establishment of a central bank, and by central I mean discrete, separate from the crown, that gave lenders confidence, something that's in the language of the new institutional economics. The central bank allows the state to make a credible commitment to repay by signaling that the bank is independent from the crown, and therefore has an incentive to pay back in order to remain a good creditor, to maintain a credit rating needed to borrow in the future. So that's just one way in which the state starts to gain autonomy from society, not just from the crown, but from society. Because today, central banks all across the world, right, often have, not in every system, but often have policy responsibility for setting interest rates, for example, in trying to combat things like inflation. And central banks are not elected, right? They're not, therefore subject to the political influences of society, and that allows them to, the bankers, the board of governors of the U.S. Federal Reserve Bank, for example, to simply apply their understanding of economic theory to the problem at hand. And you saw that when Obama came into office and had inherited this Great Recession. And his economic advisors were in agreement with the Fed in their view that what the American economy needed was a massive influx of capital. So between the budgeting of the U.S. Congress and following budget requests from the president, and then the central bank doing its thing with regard to the money supply, the government made choices that were quite unpopular, although ultimately singularly successful, with large segments of the population, because it was massively increasing the deficit and the national debt. But the neo-Keynesian ideas behind that were such that was deemed the best way to respond to the Great Recession and get out of it as fast as we can. So there you kind of a little story about autonomy. From these dynamics of the societal origins of the state and the emergence of degrees of autonomy come um, an emergent property, if you understand that concept, that arises from those dynamics, a rational property, a rational agent. And I believe it was Auguste Comte, who said, the principal function of the state is simply to think. That is the primary act of the state, or the primary um, reason for being of the state, is to act on raison d'état, the national interest, the reason of state. So there you have this kind of early idea that the state is a rational actor. It can calculate costs and benefits associated with various policy choices and make the ones that maximizes its utility function. Right? So state is a rational actor. Eventually, all of these theorists tell a similar story. Weber focuses on this most closely, or most directly. But that hegemony we talked about, the state being the only source of violence within the country, within the state, is finally reached. And as I noted yesterday, Weber actually comes to define the modern state in those terms: that which has a monopoly on the legitimate use of force or violence in society. And then finally, from all of that emerges a state acting as a moral agent. Hegel, I think it was, that said the state is but the march of God across the earth, right? That the idea here is that given its capacity to act as an independent autonomous agent and its obligations that it inherits from its societal origins, we have a state embodied with, or imbued with, or endowed with a moral responsibility, moral and ethical responsibilities, right? So a moral agent. So think about these terms, right? The state is grounded in society, emerges organically from it. To carry out the functions that the society wants from the state, it must gain that degree of autonomy so it can act actually on behalf of society. From those dynamics emerges a state with a capacity to reason, to act on raison d'état. Hegemony is obtained, the monopoly on violence that is definitional for Weber in terms of the state is achieved. And then as a result of those conditions, we have the state as a moral agent endowed with ethical responsibility. So that, I assert, is those are the broad contours of what I refer to as the state and the global political imaginary. And the idea here is that in Africa, we are talking about a very different species altogether, right? As François Bayard, French scholar of the political sociologist, did a lot of work on the state, kind of looked at, and Africa in particular, and he referred to the state there as the imported state, right? So right off the bat, we're obviously talking about a different origin story altogether, right? So if it's imported, well, it's not societally grounded, right? So, I'd ask you, how many of these stories that we've just heard, these origin stories, are, explanations for the accountings for the emergence of state in early modern Europe, fit the state story in Africa, right? Well, no, none of them, right? Now, it is true that colonization hit the whole non-Western world. Nowhere escaped it, right? But it's important to realize that it did not land on Africa's shores, oddly enough, given its proximity, until Europe had actually some 400 years to perfect the art or craft of colonial governance, this colonial machine, or as was referred to in the Congo by the Congolese as Bula Matari, that Congolese expression for the crusher of rocks, and that was actually a reference to Morton Stanley himself when he arrived at the mouth of the Congo River and couldn't get in because there was all this rock. Instead of having his team carry the boats, inland until they could find a way to get into the water, he simply ordered his porters to simply crush all the rocks, making them an entrance to the river right there at the mouth. And the locals observed this and gave Stanley the name Bulamatari, crusher of rocks. Crawford Young uses that term Bulamatari to talk about the colonial state that gets constructed by Europe in Africa late in the colonial era, right? Because they have now had 400 years of practice, they've gotten better at it. They've gotten more effective at transforming social relations, and it is, the image of a crusher of rocks for the colonial state in Africa is a pretty powerful image, right? And so the reality is African states remain troubled, right? Why? Again, is there a state in Africa? One can argue no, I think not really, right? It simply does not share any of the experiences and dynamics of state building that characterize the European experience, upon which our understanding of what states are is predicated, is built, right? We will, in our section on colonialism, we'll talk again about, the specifics of colonial rule and governance, and we'll, again, have a focus on Africa as well as Asia. But for now, I think it's just enough to appreciate that none of the accountings of where the state comes from in the social theory of the state, again, written by those who were kind of eyewitness to it, remotely fits the African story, right? So why would the state in Africa share any of its attributes and, comparably have the capacity to carry out or execute its behavioral imperatives, right? So it does not, and hence its location in the failed states, fragile states index. So this just kind of leads me to ask, kind of backing out of the African context, but for the whole of the state system, something I did similar for Cote d'Ivoire, right? I mean, think about the forces that are operative in the contemporary era and the impacts that these myriad forces have on the integrity, the capacity, the sovereignty, if you will, of states. On the one hand, we have these forces of globalization that, as Giddens will explain in detail better than I can offer, mean that governors of the political leaders, political governors of states have less power than they had in previous periods. They have just less capacity. I'll just give an example of how this works very quickly. In an era of globalization, when we particularly have, say, a global assembly line, Ford no longer builds its trucks in Detroit, right? Ford builds its trucks all over the world. Now, for the United States government, for the Treasury Department, that raises questions of taxation, right? How do you tax a corporate entity like Ford when the production process is global, sales are global, marketing is global, right? How does it get, how does Uncle Sam get his dollar, right? And so it's just generic, kind of in a general way, globalization makes that more complicated. And this is about the United States, right? I mean, the U.S. has a very long arm. The reach is felt globally. When I came to Thailand, opened up a couple of bank accounts, the first form I filled out in each case was an IRS, Internal Revenue Service tax form for the United States. So they know where I am. But nevertheless, consider this notion, what's called transfer pricing. Let's just imagine that Ford opens up an assembly plant in South Africa. They construct, let's just say, a good chunk of the truck, although we know it's actually built in many, many countries and in many, many states within the U.S., but it's just built all over the place. Let's just, for simplicity's sake, say that a good chunk of, if not most of the truck is built in South Africa. We start with the proposition, how does the U.S. tax Ford when it's operating in a sovereign state like South Africa? That would require agreements with the two governments that may or may not be okay or easy to obtain. But it gets worse than that, right? Because Ford doesn't just send the trucks from South Africa back to the United States to be sold on the American market or ship them to Europe to be sold in the European market, where again bilateral, multilateral agreements could be reached for taxing purposes. But actually what South Africa will do, or Ford Motor Company is the point here, will actually send these trucks for whatever final purpose to Ireland. One can conceive of this as just kind of putting finishing touches on the truck in a plant in Ireland. Why Ireland? Well, Ireland has no corporate income tax that is extractable by outsiders. So Ireland becomes a shelter for Ford's corporate profits, right? Because Ford has to register profits somewhere, right? So if it sells a truck in Europe that was built in South Africa, does it register its profit in Europe or in South? No, it registers it in Ireland, the place where corporate tax rates are near zero. So yes, the U.S. can access those resources the tax monies that are there in Ireland. But the fact that Ireland taxes at near zero means there's just nothing for the government to get. And so what Ford has done is effectively stashed away its profits in a tax shelter like the sovereign state of Ireland. Another way this happens, even more nefarious. Imagine a transnational corporation like, and again, I'm picking on the hegemon just to show if the hegemon can't do it, then how do smaller, weaker countries try to do this sort of thing? General Electric, major corporation, flies its employees, from executives to middle management, all over the world every day. So that's a lot of money being spent on airfare. Of course, it has its own fleet for its highest executives, but most of them fly commercial. So what companies like GE started doing in the early globalized era was opening up their own wholly owned subsidiary travel agency to do the booking and ticketing and selling of the fares to its own people, to its own agents, to its own employees. But of course, they didn't open up that travel agency for GE, the GE travel agency in New York or Chicago. They opened it up in Barbados. Right? Again, a place where there's like zero corporate profit, right? Zero corporate tax rate. And then they just did some things that were just patently unethical. They would overcharge GE by very large margins for each ticket sold. Right, so they buy from Delta 1,000 tickets at $750 a ticket, but sell those tickets to GE itself. Remember this GE travel agent is a wholly owned subsidiary of General Electric. But the travel agency sells to GE those $750 tickets for, say, $10,000. Right? What's happening here? GE is sending that $9,250, $9,250 to its travel agency, which will record profit of $9,250, which the IRS, the government, the U.S. government, can tax, except that Barbados doesn't tax corporate at anything other than almost zero. So once again, there's nothing there for the U.S. government to seize. It's just been, flitted away into the globalized ether. right? It just disappears, but it didn't really disappear. GE got the profit. It's just not anywhere that the state can get at it. So that's just one example of how globalization has disempowered states to do. Yesterday what I said was the primary, perhaps the most important function of the state, which is revenue, right? And as Anthony Giddens will talk about, globalization has other weakening effects on states as well. Decentralization. So I spoke, and Giddens will again speak about how globalization and the emergence of supranational organizations like the United Nations or the European Union, states voluntarily surrendering their sovereignty upwards to these supranational organizations. Well, at the same time, all across the globe, in fact, states are also in the business or in the process of decentralizing their power. Like in Britain, for example, we talked about how London devolved power to Scotland, gave Scotland its own parliament. The Ballyrood, Northern Ireland, got its assembly, and the Scottish Assembly is quite an important assembly. It has the only powers it doesn't really have kind of rely in the area of, say, foreign policy and military defense. So there we see, right, at the same time that states are surrendering sovereignty upwards to supranational organizations, they're also surrendering it downwards to subnational entities. Where then does sovereignty lie if it's going up and it's going down, and as Giddens will say, it's also going sideways too. We have, I mentioned WikiLeaks here simply because, I've tried to make the argument that we live in a complex threat environment, and digital is one of those, right? So the capacity of a few hackers to inflict significant diplomatic damage on the United States by hacking into, stealing, and releasing just a treasure trove of secret State Department cables demonstrated the vulnerability of modern states in the modern era. International organizations, as we've talked about, now taking over state functions, and many realists say they simply serve the interests of the powerful states, but that's a gross overstatement. And international organizations start to come to have interests of their own, and start to do things for and on behalf of states that states can't seem to do as well or at all. We have international crime, international drug cartels. I mentioned that in Mexico. The body count, I think we agreed on finally yesterday, was over 100,000 since 2006. And then our discussion of last week on ethno-nationalism, this kind of ground up centrifugal force. Given all of those together, right, whether the state is, I think, a reasonable question to ask. So again, there are those who see the state as quite at its end, doomed with no hope of recovery. I'm not there. I'm not in that group. I think there are those who think there really isn't anything significant going on with the state. It's just a period of transition, and the state will adapt and come through unchanged. And I'm not in that camp either. I think that's naive. I think the state faces a crisis. I don't think the crisis constitutes the end or an unavoidable end. But as Eikenberry will say about the liberal order in our final reading of the course, I think states will have to rethink themselves in terms of what their functionalities are and how they are situated in a globalized economy and an international society if they are going to continue to be relevant and to rescue themselves from what is reasonably characterized as a pretty sustained period of state decline. Okay, that's it. That took longer than I thought, but I think it was important to do. Okay, and I hope you liked the Sheikh Lo. He's one of my favorites. Cheers.